Welcome to MMA True Fan, a biographical podcast series on legendary mixed martial artists. In this episode on Wanderlei Silva, hear exclusive interviews with Rafael Cordeiro, Rich Franklin, Dan Henderson, Tito Ortiz, Wanderlei Silva, and more. Please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening.
Wanderlei Silva was one of those guys where, there was a lot of champions. There's champions that you wouldn't mind. You wouldn't be too scary to fight. Wanderlei Silva, no matter what, no matter when, that's a scary dude to fight. Remember that last Rafael fight? I thought he killed him.
But the way he trains, the way he fights, he never was afraid to go into his opponent. He always fought against, it doesn't matter size, he fought against big guys. He fought the same way he fought the guys the same size as him. Because he have a lot of heart, his mentality to go there. He put his mentality inside the octagon to go there to kill or die.
Great friend, love Wanderlei Silva, great family man. His wife, T, is awesome, Thor is awesome, his son, and he's a great person, man, very compassionate. I mean, you pissed him off, you're messing with the wrong guy, you poke a tiger. But overall, super individual.
MMA True Fan presents Wanderlei Silva by Rich Donahue and Nate Evans.
There is a unique contrast when talking about Wanderlei Silva. As a fighter, he personified cold-blooded violence. He would pressure opponents fearlessly and smash them with punches and knees before stomping on their faces and soccer kicking them in the head. He was quite possibly the most brutal and intimidating fighter in the sport's history. And to be quite honest, we may never see a fighter like him again. And people who know him go out of their way to say how he's a really good person, how he's kind, compassionate, and generous. Former UFC middleweight champion and UFC Hall of Famer Rich Franklin shares a story about a time when Wanderlei was visiting a children's hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio.
He seems like a very intense personality if you base that judgment on his fighting style. But when you get to know him, he's actually a very soft-hearted gentleman. When he was in Cincinnati here, when I competed against Henderson that weekend, several of the athletes had gone to the local children's hospital to visit some of the kids. And I was friends at the time with some of the nurses who worked there. And I was speaking to one of the ladies I knew because I frequently go there and visit children. And one of the ladies said, back in October, I think I was there for Christmas that year. Back in October, when, the athletes were here, and one of the athletes, Silva, came in, and I thought she was talking about Henderson. I'm like, wait a minute. He came in and did a visit to the hospital during fight week, and we got talking. I figured out she was talking about Wanderlei, and she said, oh, yeah, and he was so sweet to the kids. And I looked at her all confused. I said, Wanderlei? And she said, yeah, he was just the nicest gentleman. He was so sweet to the nurses. And I'm like, Wanderlei, you do realize they call him the axe murderer. And she had nothing but great things to say about that guy. And then I hadn't met him at the time. But then subsequently when I met him, I understood why she had nice things to say about him.
Wanderlei Cesar da Silva was born on July 3, 1976, in Curitiba, Brazil, a city of little under 2 million people, about 250 miles southwest of Sao Paulo. Soccer is widely considered to be the national pastime in Brazil, but combat sports are popular as well. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is considered to be one of the most effective martial arts in the world, and while it is popular throughout much of Brazil, it isn't the most popular martial art in Curitiba, as King's MMA founder and legendary trainer Rafael Cordeiro explains.
One of the best places in the world to train Muay Thai. Curitiba have probably more than 200 Muay Thai gyms, at least 200. So you can train all over the place there. It doesn't matter your location, at least have 10 gyms around your house, at least. So it's hard to fight there because you fight in the street, everybody knows Muay Thai, so it's complicated to fight the street.
Wanderlei came from humble beginnings. His family owned a small bar restaurant that his parents operated. His father also made deliveries and worked other jobs on the side. In a YouTube video published years ago, where Wanderlei visited his family in Curitiba, he explained how he didn't live in the nicer part of town. Through translation, he said, when the paved street ends and the houses are different, that's where I used to live. Curitiba isn't exceptionally dangerous compared to some other areas of Brazil, but it has crime rates that are higher than in most U.S. cities. Wanderlei grew up poor, in a rough part of town, in one of the harder parts of the world. While his family wasn't well off financially, Their love and support provided a stable home life for him and his older brother Daniil and sister Danila.
Growing up, Wanderlei would spend a lot of his time outside with friends, as he shares.
I don't have so much toys because I came from a poor family, but I have a lot of friends on the street. We play soccer, we play some bets. Because I like baseball. I play a lot in the streets.
Wanderlei didn't have luxuries as a child and knew he had less than many other people. He had dreams and wanted more in life, but was able to maintain a positive outlook and have fun in other ways.
One of my dreams when I was a kid is I wanted to have a video game. I don't have. I need to play in the other guy's house, need to wait. I don't have so much toys. I don't have parties. But I'm happy because I have a lot of friends. We play each other. We are all in the situation. I grew up in the hard times, but we are happy anyway.
Wanderlei was overweight as a child and often found himself being a target for bullies. And even though he made the most of his financial situation, he was far from being satisfied. He was bitter and angry. He wanted a better life in more ways than one. And it was during this time where he developed his feelings of rage that he channeled years later as a fighter. When Wanderlei was 13 years old, he began training at the vaunted Schribjer Box Academy, where he'd meet one of the men who would help change his life, his closest mentor, Rafael Cordeiro. It didn't take long for Wanderlei to make an impression on Cordeiro and his instructors.
I thought this kid is a really good kid. He started training with me, and then he developed his game. I started putting him in different situations all the time because I knew it. The kid had something special. He never was afraid to do anything inside the gym. So all those guys that I say, Wanderlei, you have to fight with this guy. He say, okay. And they have to fight against that guy. Guys inside the gym, but bigger than him. Some guys with more experience than him. But, if we start training with those guys, I saw, man, this kid's phenomenal kid.
Wanderlei found someone he could look up to in Cordeiro, someone he could try to emulate.
Yeah, because Rafael, for me, he's a little bit older than me. He's a more graduate to fight. And I grew up in the gym watching him fight in the big stages, do a show, make a good show. He dressing nice, he's smart, he have a beautiful girlfriend. And I look for him, man, this guy is the guy. He fighting good, he have his style. And I copy some things off him. He, for me, be like my old brother.
Wanderlei started working at his family bar during this time as well. He would train and work on top of going to school, so it was a busy time. This helped him establish a strong work ethic that would help him years later in competition. His father was working 3 jobs, his mother worked, his brother was training in capoeira and working, so for Wanderlei, he wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. Every once in a while, Wanderlei would need to use his training to take care of a situation at the bar, but it was only on a rare occasion.
Yeah, like some guys wanna fight against me, some guys don't respect me. This sometimes happens.
When Wanderlei was 18, he entered the Brazilian army. He found himself going to a special school right away for a sergeant-like position, but left the army about 18 months later when his term ended. The army instilled a strong sense of discipline in Wanderlei, which would carry over into his fighting career later on. Over the next few years, Wanderlei would continue training and developing as a fighter. Schribjer Box was a perfect fit for him.
The guys helped me a lot because when I arrived in the gym, when I have 13 years old, I am very shy, I'm fat, I don't know how to do nothing, right? In the gym, I start to lose weight, I start to learn the fight, I start to have some challengers. I won when in the days when the guys are gonna have a sparring day in the gym, my stomach, I've been very nervous, and I pass all that situations inside the gym. I learned everything. I learned with the old guys. When I arrived there, I am the youngest guy, and all the gym are older than me. And the guys are very smart guys. The guys fighting good. The guys are so curious. And with that, I grew up with good examples.
He would go on to become one of the more dominant athletes of the gym. In November of 1996, Schribjer Box founder Rujimar Federico had to fill in a spot for an upcoming Vale Tudo show in Rio de Janeiro. He approached Rafael Cordeiro about it.
My master came to me and said, Rafael, we have 5 names, then you have to put in a list, and probably going to miss one. I say, Master, let's talk with Wanderlei because Wanderlei is ready to go. I say, really? So I think he's ready to do. What do you think? I say, Master, let's do it. Wanderlei is more than ready. And we traveled to Rio de Janeiro. Wanderlei, for sure, he did what he did in the gym all day. He knocked his opponent out. It was the quickest knockout of the night.
Vanderlei's professional fighting career began at Brazilian Vale Tudo Fighting 6 on November 1st, 1996, against a guy named Dilson Filho. Filho took Vanderlei down right away, but they quickly got back up and started slugging it out. There was a really high pace for a few minutes, until both appeared to be exhausted. Filho appeared to be mostly laying on Vanderlei by the end, but Vanderlei finished it with a couple of stiff elbows and a knee.
Vanderlei spent much of his early fighting career in the International Vale Tudo Championship Organization, which we will refer to here as IVC. This was true, no-holds-barred, bare-knuckle fighting. These fights were in a ring, with a net attached from the bottom rope to the ring apron to prevent fighters from sliding out. The fighting was especially brutal and extreme by today's standards. Moves that were banned by nearly all organizations today, like eye gouging, biting, and fish hooks, were all on the table. This was the world where Vanderlei would cut his teeth in the sport. Many fighters from the Shoot Box Academy are known for their aggressive striking and brutal finishes. Grappling and jiu-jitsu have also been key parts of their game for many years, dating back to the 90s. Rafael Cordeiro shares a time when they saw a video that shifted their thinking on submission fighting.
Because you saw one in 1991, we saw a tape. Somebody sent a tape in Curitiba, and the tape was jiu-jitsu against luta livre. And it was the Graces, Marcelo, Murilo Bustamante, Walid Ismail, Fábio Gurgel. The guys beat they beat the guys from luta livre. So after this show, 1991, we saw, I say, man, it's time to learn jiu-jitsu because we have good stand-up, we have good stand-up, we have good Muay Thai, but if these guys put us in the floor, we don't know what to do.
In September of 1997, Vanderlei entered a tournament at IVC 2, where he knocked out 2 guys in 4 minutes of total action. In his next fight, he suffered a big cut just below his left eyebrow, early in the first round, possibly from a illegal intentional headbutt. His cut got bigger as he continued to headbutt his opponent again and again. After about 13 minutes that saw Silva dominate his opponent, the fight ended from a doctor's stoppage due to his cut. After his first professional loss, Vanderlei went on to face NCAA national champion wrestler Mike Van Arsdale at IVC 6. Van Arsdale took Vanderlei down and cut his eye. Vanderlei got back up and landed a hard knee to the body that ultimately put Mike down. Silva then landed a soccer kick to finish it.
Vanderlei's career was on the rise. He was 5-1, with his only loss being by a doctor stoppage. His next fight would be his first in the Ultimate Fighting Championship at Ultimate Brazil on November 16, 1998. His opponent would be another Brazilian striker with a jiu-jitsu background and one of the most popular fighters in the sport at the time, Vitor Belfort. Vanderlei and Vitor were both 21 years old. Vanderlei was a hungry fighter on the rise. Vitor was the established star. Both fighters had the same record at 5-1. This fight had a lot riding on it. Vitor won the fight by TKO early in the first round with a highlight reel flurry. It was a difficult loss for Vanderlei, but his best days were still in front of him. He bounced back in the IVC with 2 knockout wins that, combined, lasted less than a minute total. The first fight at IVC 9 was against Adrian Serrano. Cordeiro was competing as a fighter during this time and fought an epic 30-minute match 2 fights earlier the same night. He won the fight, but sustained a lot of damage during it. Cordeiro wished Vanderlei luck as he was going out, and then he took a shower. When Cordeiro got done, Vanderlei was already back, sitting in the locker room.
Vanderlei's next fight would be his return to the UFC, at UFC 20, against submission fighter Tony Patera. Patera did his best to tie him up, but after a couple of minutes, Vanderlei was able to work his way into a Muay Thai clinch and land sharp knees to the head that put Patera down. Vanderlei made his debut in the Pride Fighting Championships in September of 1999 at Pride 7 against Karl Malenko. Malenko is known for his wrestling and was able to get a hold of Vanderlei right away and take the fight to the ground. Vanderlei pulled a nice reversal and swept Malenko. Once they got back to their feet, Vanderlei landed some heavy knees to Karl's head. Malenko soon had this fight back on the ground. Vanderlei stayed busy off his back, with short hooks to the size of Malenko's head. These punches appeared to get stronger as Vanderlei found his timing.
This fight had plenty of ground action, with lots of different positions. Vanderlei showed an ability in this fight to be able to strike effectively from anywhere on the ground as well. In the end, Vanderlei won a unanimous decision in what was mostly a one-sided fight. Vanderlei would next find himself going against his first Japanese opponent, Daiji Matsui. Vanderlei was able to use his strength advantage in this fight and control Matsui in the grappling and deliver punishing strikes. Silva used his Muay Thai clinch to deliver several heavy knees to Matsui's face. Matsui got the worst of most of their exchanges and ended up bleeding all over the place. Commentator Stephen Quadros said Matsui was taking the beating of his life in there. Vanderlei went on to win a unanimous decision. His next opponent would be Dutch striker Dirty Bob Schribjer. Pride had initially arranged for Bob to face a Japanese sumo wrestler, as he explains.
I said, yeah, okay, big fat sumo guy. I thought, okay, I didn't prepare at all for this fight. And I said, yeah, okay, I want to fight him. I thought, okay, move a little bit in and out, and maybe I can knock him down.
But when Bob arrived in Japan, the plans for him had changed.
They said, we're going to give you another opponent. Oh, okay. And who is that? That's Wanderlei Silva. And I heard his name somewhere. And I thought, he's a bit better than the big fat Japanese sumo guy.
Silva and Schribjer showed each other a lot of respect in the stand-up game. Schribjer is one of the most established strikers that Silva had faced up until that point. After some circling, Wanderlei stepped in and engaged with punches and knees. Schribjer showed good strikes of his own, which led to Silva taking him down. Once on the ground, Silva used his Brazilian jiu-jitsu to control Schribjer and work his way into a rear naked choke. Wanderlei would soon find himself fighting for the vacant UFC light heavyweight title at the age of 22, against another young star just a couple of years older than him, Tito Ortiz. Silva was released from Pride following his win over Schribjer for unknown reasons. His next fight against Ortiz would be the most important of his career up until that point.
The guy sent me off from Pride on that day. After that, I fight with him and the matchmaker, the Japanese matchmaker, be in the stadium. And he said, hey, after the fight, I'm going to talk to you because we're going to bring him again on Pride.
The people at Pride told Wanderlei that they would bring him back if he beat Ortiz. This quickly became a must-win situation for him. Ortiz was known at the time for good wrestling and causing a lot of damage once he took you down. Ortiz was familiar with Silva and his fighting style.
What did you know about Wanderlei before you fought him? Because that was back in '99, obviously.
Yeah, no, so we go way back. I mean, I remember watching Wanderlei on some VHS tapes, and he fought Mike Van Arsdale and knocked him out. And I know who Mike Van Arsdale is. I mean, he was on the Olympic team and so forth, and I mean, I was like, wow. He made Mike Van Arsdale look like this guy must be dangerous. And then I started watching one of his fights, how brutal he was, and he fought with just pure axe murderer emotions, man. It was like no other. And I knew I had to wrestle good to beat him.
It didn't take long for Wanderlei to step in and throw punches. But when he did, Tito ducked under and got a nice double leg takedown. Wanderlei found himself on his back in Tito's corner. From there, Tito stayed busy with steady ground and pound and controlled the action to finish the round. In the second round, Wanderlei engaged right away, connecting with the right hand to make Tito shoot, but Wanderlei sprawled out of it. Tito would then hit Wanderlei right on the button with a right hand that put Wanderlei down. It then appeared as if he was going for one of Tito's legs.
I mean, I remember when I dropped him in the second round, and I heard him go, oh! And he like, I thought he was shooting a double on me, but it was actually falling, and he fell into my legs. And I sprawled, he pulled guard, and he was out, but he was awake, and he was making noises, the weirdest thing. And I hit him again, and I think that's what woke him up.
Tito was back on top of Silva and controlled the action again throughout the rest of the round. In the fourth round, Silva landed a right hand that caught Tito.
I swear he hit me so hard, it felt like the world went upside down. He's one of the hardest hitting guys I've ever been hit by. Like where I felt it, where it scared me. I mean, that was the first time I've ever been really hit, but where it hit me and it scared me. I mean, not many fighters will say that because they're not humble enough to say it, but, you know, that was one punch that I felt that hit me and it scared the shit out of me. But it was just, once again, I went into recovery mode, do or die mode, and to run away was my first instinct. If you've ever watched that fight, I ran away at the opposite side of the octagon. He came chasing after me, and I heard him going, like he was trying to kill me. It was like a monkey chasing me. It was the craziest thing in the world.
Wanderlei had Tito in trouble for a moment, but Tito was able to get another takedown and get it back to the ground. After 4 rounds of action, commentator Jeff Blatnick said he felt Ortiz was winning the fight due to his wrestling.
That was a really great fight that we fought against each other because we both dropped each other, and it just came down to the last round.
Ortiz's wrestling made the difference in the 5th round again, and he went on to win a unanimous decision. This was a crushing loss for Wanderlei from a career standpoint.
And after I lost, the matchmaker don't came talk to us. Like, I don't know, because we lost. We lost. And that be a difficult time because I don't have another event to go. I don't know what's going to happen.
He'd fought in the world's 2 largest organizations, but now he was out of a job. He had fought his way out of Curitiba once before to reach the world stage, and he was determined to do it again.
But after that, I start to training more and more, and I'm back better after these tough moments.
The ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu once said, "Victory is reserved for those willing to pay its price." Following his loss to Ortiz in August of 2000, Wanderlei would go undefeated in Pride for the next 4 years, while fighting some of the best in the sport. But he'd have to take a few steps back before moving forward, as he explains.
I fought in Pride and I fought in UFC, but after that I'm back to fight in Curitiba, my hometown, because I don't have other way to go. And the guys make one event over here. I fought for like $1,000 over here. And I won. After this victory, my career started again in Japan.
Following a 39-second knockout over Todd Medina at Mecha Vale Tudo 2 in Brazil, Wanderlei would be brought back to Pride to face a well-established veteran in Guy Mezger. Mezger trained with Ken Shamrock's vaunted Lions Den gym and held many victories in the Japanese organization Pancras, with wins over top fighters like Minoru Suzuki, Yuki Kondo, and Semi Schilt. Mezger also held a win over Tito Ortiz. Guy was a good wrestler with strong kickboxing skills. Their fight started with great stand-up action. Mezger was more than willing to stand and strike with Wanderlei, and actually cut Silva around his right eye during one of their early exchanges. Mezger appeared to be doing well and fighting aggressively, as he showed great kicks and punches.
After some great exchanges, where it looked like they both landed heavy shots, Mezger landed a head kick that wasn't overly strong but landed cleanly. Silva smiled and pressed forward, before landing a crushing right hook to put Mezger down. Silva swarmed on him, but Mezger's wrestling background came into play as he reversed Silva and landed a hard knee before standing back up. When they got back to their feet, Mezger's knees looked wobbly, and it appeared as if he hadn't fully recovered from the punch. Silva smelled it, and immediately went in for the kill. Mezger showed some good clinch work, trying to slow him down, but Silva landed several big shots, before landing a big right hand that knocked Mezger out.
This fight went a long way in re-establishing Wanderlei's place in the organization, and provided a preview of what was to be expected over the next several years for Pride fans. It showed Silva's classic formula of constantly pressuring his opponents, until hurting them, and then finishing the fight in dramatic fashion. His next fight would be ruled a no contest, after he kicked Gilbert Yvel in the groin 20 seconds into the fight. Wanderlei would then face Team Quest fighter Dan Henderson. Henderson had made a name for himself in the UFC and Ring's organization, with wins over Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Renato Babalu Sobral, Gilbert Yvel, and Carlos Newton. Henderson wasn't familiar with Wanderlei.
Did you know much about him before your first fight in Pride?
No, I had no idea who he was before that. I was actually scheduled to fight Vitor Belfort that event. Either way, it was only a 3-week notice fight for me anyway, but it was supposed to be Vitor, and then Vitor got hurt and pulled out, and they put Wanderlei in there, and I said, okay, whatever. And, I had heard some different things about Wanderlei, but I didn't really know what he looked like until I got to Japan and saw him. Like, that's the guy I'm fighting. Holy shit.
Henderson was undefeated at the time, and he was a world-class wrestler, having served in the 1992 and 1996 Greco-Roman Olympic teams. He was known for having a big right-hand punch as well. This was also a match between two of the top mixed martial arts camps in the world at the time, Wanderlei's Shute Box Academy versus Henderson's Team Quest. This fight had great hand-to-hand exchanges throughout, with Wanderlei landing strong hooks, and Dan throwing his big right hand and landing it in lots of different ways. At one point, Wanderlei was in the full mount and holding Dan by the neck as he punched him in the face repeatedly. Dan was resilient though and fought on. Henderson's teammate and cornerman at the time, UFC Hall of Famer Randy Couture, was there.
I literally thought Wanderlei was trying to kill Dan. He jumped up from the full mount 2 feet from my face and tried to stomp Dan in the face, and I was just shocked. It was so close to me. I literally had my elbows on the apron right there in front of Danny when he jumped up from the full mount and stomped on both sides of Dan's face, and I was like, holy shit, he was trying to kill him.
Wanderlei won the fight by unanimous decision. His next fight would be against Japanese sensation Kazushi Sakuraba. Sakuraba was possibly the most famous fighter in the world at the time, having defeated 4 members of the Gracie family, as well as other top fighters like Vitor Belfort and Carlos Newton. It's almost impossible to overstate his significance to the Japanese fans in the early 2000s. Former Pride commentator Stephen Quadros shares.
Sakuraba was so unique. He came from a small town in the outskirts. He didn't come from the big city. He liked to drink a little bit. He liked to smoke cigarettes. He was the everyman. He didn't really do a lot of smack talk, but he had this wry little sense of humor that people connected with. The public, the working man, they connected with this guy. And he was a world-class submission wrestler, catch wrestler. So when he would get in there against jiu-jitsu guys and beat them, he beat, 3 or 4 Gracies. it really created a phenom for back then, because at that time, the Gracies were the gold standard in mixed martial arts. And so he became a hero because he wasn't made up in some corporate meeting somewhere. This was a guy who was real.
Wanderlei was known to be a dangerous striker at the time, but he was a heavy underdog against Sakuraba. Many people expected Sakuraba to get past Wanderlei's strikes and grapple him into submission, like he had his other opponents. Pride went through some changes during this time that may have played a role in this fight, as Quadros explains.
Pride had previously taken away soccer kicks and knees to a grounded opponent. But then when Wanderlei Silva and Sakuraba fought that first fight, they reinstated those old rules to where you could kick someone on the ground and knee someone on the ground, which played right into Wanderlei's strength.
Wanderlei went straight at Sakuraba, landing a barrage of punches and knees before knocking him down. Silva then planted his hands on Sakuraba's shoulders and drilled him with knees at the top of his head over and over again. Sakuraba tried to roll into a better position, but Wanderlei stood up and soccer kicked him in the face a couple of times before the referee stopped it. The crowd was in stunned disbelief. A lot of people thought Sakuraba was the best in the world at the time. Not only did Sakuraba lose, he got demolished by Wanderlei. Sakuraba looked like he didn't even belong in the ring with him. While much of the mixed martial arts world was surprised by the way Wanderlei smashed Sakuraba, the people at Chute Box weren't. Rafael Cordeiro shares their sentiment leading up to it.
A lot of people thought Sakuraba was going to whoop his ass because he has bad jiu-jitsu, he beat a lot of Gracies, blah, 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 blah. But never for us. The kind of conversation for us never came like the way they think. Well, we just put more hard work over we always did in the gym. Anyway, Sakuraba is such a great fighter, but Wanderlei is different level.
The win over Sakuraba was a major turning point in Wanderlei's career, as he explains.
How did the Japanese fans treat you after that first Sakuraba fight? Did they love you? Did they hate you? Were they afraid of you?
This is an interesting question, because after I beat the idol over there, all the Japanese fans adopt me and treat me like a huge star over there. I can't go anywhere because I have a lot of people want to take a pictures. And a lot of guys coming close to you just to touch your arm or just touching you, because the guys thinking the fighters be a different persons. I don't know. Is that lucky you touch the fighter? I don't know why, but there's a lot of people came. And after that, after I beat Sakuraba, I won, I think, in 22 fights on the whole. And with that, my name grew up a lot because I be a lot in TV. I fight with all the different guys, heavyweights, champions, Olympic champions. And with that, the Japanese fans start to love me. And it's so good to support when I have over there.
So you went from feeling like you didn't have a place to fight to a year later, you knocked out Sakuraba.
Yeah. From nothing to the glorious. That's the artist life. Because sometimes some things bad happen, so something better gonna happen. Now we never know, but we always need to be ready to give back.
Prior to this fight, Wanderlei was thought of mostly as a bruiser who liked to mix it up. This began his ascent to becoming one of the most dominant and feared fighters in the sport's history. Wanderlei's next fight will be against young fighter Shungo Oyama. Oyama wasn't afraid to get into a stare-down match with Wanderlei at the beginning. These two went at it right away, with Oyama landing a good right hand, forcing Wanderlei to go into takedown mode for a second, before landing a big left that rocked Oyama. The referee stepped in almost immediately, and after what appeared to be a bit of an early stoppage. It almost looked like there were other forces at play here, with them stopping it so soon, like they were trying to save Oyama from too much damage.
Wanderlei would now find himself in a rematch with Sakuraba. This fight had a lot riding on it. No one thought Wanderlei's first one was a fluke, but there were some feelings that maybe he caught Sakuraba off guard and seized on an opportunity. Many people were wondering how Sakuraba would bounce back and what adjustments he'd make. This would undoubtedly be one of the biggest fights of Wanderlei's career. Sakuraba took him down right away after catching a low kick and turning it into a beautiful ankle pick. Wanderlei was able to find his way back up, though, after a minute or two, which led to some good exchanges in the stand-up position. Sakuraba wasn't afraid to stand up with Wanderlei and landed a couple of good shots. Wanderlei dropped Sakuraba with a big right hand, but Sakuraba was able to bounce back quickly and mount an offense of his own.
Sakuraba went for several submissions, but was never really close to finishing anything, until he latched on what looked like a tight guillotine choke. The crowd started to ramp up before Wanderlei lifted Sakuraba in the air and slammed him down on top of Sakuraba's left shoulder. The fight continued for a few more minutes before the bell rang to end the round. When Sakuraba sat up to go back to his corner, an abnormal bulge could be seen on his left shoulder. Sakuraba poked at it a little, but appeared to be in obvious pain. Once the doctors looked and saw it was a broken clavicle, the fight was stopped. Wanderlei shared a prediction with the Japanese fans prior to their rematch, which turned out to be prophetic, as Rafael Cordeiro explains.
And then I have opportunity to do the second one same way. Before the fight, when they say I'm going to send Sakuraba to hospital, and then the guys, the Japanese, look, Wanderlei say. And then after the fight, Sakuraba was in the hospital.
After Wanderlei's second win over Sakuraba, it became clear who the guy to beat in Japan was. Wanderlei was ready to take on all comers, and the Pride people were eager to line up their den of Japanese fighters. A win over Silva could propel a Japanese fighter to stardom for the organization. Japanese Pride fighters were known for having tremendous heart and fortitude. They would endure an excessive amount of damage and refuse to quit at times when many others likely would. Wanderlei's fighting style, going against fighters with this mentality, often made for memorable moments and exciting finishes.
Wanderlei's next opponent would be Alexander Otsuka. Silva's well-roundedness came into play in this fight. He was able to show good takedowns and ground-and-pound action. Otsuka stayed competitive in the fight throughout most of it. He hit Wanderlei with a couple of good shots in the stand-up position, and his wrestling was better, so he was able to keep Wanderlei close when he needed. Silva landed a hard shot that broke Otsuka's nose in the third round. Once the doctor stepped in to check it, the fight was stopped. Something else that's pretty remarkable about these fights is how quickly they happened after each other. Wanderlei's second fight with Sakuraba was on November 3, 2001. His fight with Otsuka was 8 weeks later, on December 23, 2001. He then fought Kyushi Tomura 2 months later on February 24, 2002. This pattern of fighting frequently would be common throughout his Pride career.
At around this time, a new fighter was making his way into mixed martial arts from the kickboxing world, Mirko Krokop Filipovic. Krokop was a former K1 world champion, but still relatively unknown in mixed martial arts, with wins over Japanese fighters Kazuyuki Fujita and Yuji Nagata. The Pride people wanted Wanderlei to fight Krokop under special rules. Now, you fought Krokop April 28, 2002, the first time at Pride 20. You took that fight under special rules that kind of favored him. Why did you agree to it? Did you just want to fight him? Didn't care?
This is because the guy is bringing him from K1, and he's a huge star over there, like me. And the guy's bringing him to fight in Pride and say, hey, okay, you can fight against him, but on that moment, I don't know, I'm young, and I know, for me, no matter, I think I can do everything, I think I can fly, I don't know, because I feel really good. And the guy say, hey, we'll fight against him, but when the fight is going to the ground, it can be like a 10-15 seconds and need to fight on stand-up again. And I don't know why I accept these rules. And the guy say, the fight is going to the finish, it's going to be a draw anyway. And I don't know why I accept these rules, but on that moment, for me, it's okay. I say, hey, I can do everything. I think on the decision, I won the fight, but the official result is a draw.
Yeah, and I agree that I think you won that fight too. The stare down, probably one of the best of all time.
Yeah.
What did you see in his eyes? Like, what was that moment like for you?
Man, he's a tough guy. The toughest guys I fought in my life, and he's big, man. And when I look at him in the eyes, I know he's going to be a huge challenge for me.
Wanderlei was in attendance for a fight between Quinton Jackson and Kevin Randleman at Pride 25 in March 2003, when one of his more memorable moments took place. After knocking out Randleman, Quinton Jackson walked over and pointed at Wanderlei, before pointing at Randleman lying on the mat. In the post-fight interview, Jackson pointed at Wanderlei and said, "I want you, boy. It's going to be me and you." Wanderlei then stood up, nodded his head, and climbed into the ring. Jackson then told Wanderlei he was wearing Jackson's belt. Wanderlei responded by pounding his chest and yelling, "My belt," before shoving Jackson and taking a swing at him while being restrained by security. Jackson exited the ring a few seconds later and greeted fans as he walked back toward the dressing room. Wanderlei then got on a microphone and taunted Jackson from the middle of the ring, yelling, "Come on," again and again. Jackson turned to go back to the ring, but was restrained by security. The crowd was going crazy during all of this, as you can probably imagine. This was the beginning of one of the sport's great rivalries.
Jackson presented different problems for Wanderlei than most other opponents. Quinton was one of the best in the world, with knockout power, freakish strength, and good wrestling. It would only be a matter of time before their paths crossed again. In August of 2003, Wanderlei would take on Sakuraba for the third time. This fight would be part of the opening round of the Prix Middleweight Grand Prix tournament that year, which included top fighters like Quinton Jackson, Chuck Liddell, Alistair Overeem, and Murilo Bustamante. Prior to this fight, Wanderlei addressed the Japanese media and stirred controversy with his comments, as Rafael Cordeiro shares.
And the third fight was like, it's going to be the last chance. It's going to be last chance for Sakuraba. Wanderlei sent the same message. I'm going to beat him so bad. The way when he back to his home, his wife going to think he's a guest. And the Japanese was like, oh, because like, what the heck? Look at that, what the guy say. And then our manager came to us, Kawasaki, say, please, don't say things like that. He has a wife, 2 kids. Don't say that. Yeah. Don't say that. You know? I think the Japanese was, usually here all the time. So it was, the mix between WWE and like, I'm going to kill you. Something like that,
Was he really feeling this way, or was he just kind of saying stuff?
Yeah, no, he was thinking about the same. Yeah. So, man, he said, I'm going to send the guys for hospital. I'm going to beat you so bad. He was prepared to do that.
He was serious about it, yeah.
He was serious. It was beautiful KO.
It isn't uncommon for a fighter to make outrageous predictions before a fight in order to promote it, but that wasn't the case. Wanderlei wasn't being hyperbolic. He was serious about what he said, and was probably just going off the cuff. It wasn't personal or out of spite. He and Sakuraba were friendly outside of the ring. It was just an honest answer.
Sakuraba didn't seem the least bit afraid to exchange with Wanderlei in this fight. He seemed to be trying to give Wanderlei a taste of his own medicine. Boss Rutten commented that he could feel the intensity, like something big was about to happen. A few seconds later, Wanderlei landed a huge right hook to Sakuraba's jaw that knocked him out instantly. Sakuraba remained unconscious for a few seconds, but was up and joking with Wanderlei a minute or two later. Following their third fight, it appeared as though Sakuraba was probably approaching the twilight of his career, and wasn't the enigma he was just a few years earlier. The people at Pride needed a new star to promote, and preferably someone who could beat Wanderlei.
At Pride Final Conflict 2003, Wanderlei would need to fight twice in the same night to win the middleweight Grand Prix. In his first fight, he would face a man who many thought could become Japan's next mixed martial arts superstar, Olympic judo gold medalist Hidehiko Yoshida. Yoshida was bigger and stronger than many of his Japanese contemporaries, including Sakuraba. He fought wearing a gi, and he had won all 3 of his mixed martial arts fights prior, including a win over UFC Hall of Famer Don Frye. Yoshida's likelihood for success was promising for Japanese fans. The winner of their fight would face the winner of the other semifinal match between Quinton Jackson and Chuck Liddell. Silva, Jackson, and Liddell were thought to be among the top middleweight fighters in the world at the time, with Yoshida still being relatively unknown. Training for the prospect of fighting 3 different people in one night can seem next to impossible, especially when their skill sets were so different, with Liddell being a world-class striker and Yoshida's grappling pedigree. But, in reality, Wanderlei didn't have to train any differently. He always trained for all possibilities, as Rafael Cordeiro explains.
We train everything, so we was prepared for everything. We never trained just from a specific fighter. In our training, we try to develop our skills, Because if you think about too much about your opponent, sometimes you forget about yourself. So this is the way came a lot of good results. The results came for that kind of mentality. Should be ready to train against anyone, anytime. You have to be ready. It doesn't matter your opponent's background.
Yoshida took Silva down early in the fight. The crowds at Pride events in Japan were generally very quiet. The noise level when Yoshida first put Silva on his back was deafening. Commentators Damon Perry and Boss Rutten had to yell at each other at ringside for the first few minutes. Maybe Yoshida would be the Japanese fighter to finally beat Silva. That glimmer of hope was there for a moment. Wanderlei under the gold medalist in the open guard. This is almost exactly where Kiyoshi Tamura was a few months earlier, right before Yoshida submitted him with an Ezekiel choke.
Wanderlei responded by putting Yoshida in a triangle choke. Maybe Wanderlei was outclassed on paper when it came to the submission game, but that didn't matter. There was a moment where it looked like Wanderlei was actually about to submit him. Could it be possible that Wanderlei was going to submit their Olympic gold medalist? The roller coaster of emotions for these fans must have been jolting inside the arena. Wanderlei eventually gave up on the choke, and Yoshida moved into side control. The referee then restarted them in the middle of the ring because they were getting tied up in the ropes. Once they got back in the center, Yoshida wrapped his arms around Wanderlei's head and grabbed the arm of his gi, the same technique he did to Tamura before submitting him. Wanderlei fought out of it, though, and found his way back to his feet. Yoshida had it back on the ground a short time later, where he controlled the action like he had for most of the first round.
Wanderlei came out in the second round and immediately engaged with Yoshida with punches. Yoshida went for a takedown, but Wanderlei was able to sprawl out of it and deliver knees to Yoshida's head. Then they stood up and had some of the best stand-up exchanges of the fight. As the second round wore on, Wanderlei's conditioning began to show. When Yoshida started to slow down a little, Wanderlei turned it up a notch and took control. At one point, Wanderlei was holding Yoshida's gi in the clinch and punching and kicking him in the face. Wanderlei wound up back on the ground on top of Yoshida, where he delivered some ground and pound to finish the round. He won a unanimous decision, in a fight where Yoshida impressed everyone.
Wanderlei's next fight would come later the same night, where he would square off against Quinton Jackson in the final of the tournament. This was the fight everyone had been waiting for. Jackson scooped up Silva right away for what looked like an attempted slam, but Silva wrapped him up in a pretty tight guillotine choke. After a minute of standing with Silva on his neck, Jackson took it to the ground, where he landed some good shots in Silva's guard, but didn't inflict major damage. The referee stood them back up a few minutes later. Silva then landed a barrage of punches and knees that overwhelmed Jackson and finished him with a TKO. Wanderlei was now the 2003 Pride Middleweight Grand Prix champion, one of the biggest accomplishments of his career. Wanderlei's next fight would be against another popular Japanese fighter, Yuki Kondo. After a few minutes of action, Wanderlei landed a crushing right hook to Kondo's face. Kondo immediately backpedaled across the ring in an attempt to gather himself. Wanderlei chased him, knocked him down with a flurry of punches, and stomped on his face several times before the fight was stopped. Of all the amazing, brutal finishes we saw throughout Wanderlei's career, this may have been the most shocking. Even for a fighter who was known to have tremendous heart like Kondo, it's safe to assume he probably wanted this fight to end more than anybody.
Wanderlei was like a villain to some of the Japanese fans, but not in the way we sometimes see, where fighters say things just to make people upset. He was like the big bad wolf to these fighters. He was the hammer, and they were his nails. The savagery he demonstrated in the ring was so extreme that people often wondered where it came from. Prior to his fight with Kazuhiro Nakamura, commentator Mauro Ranallo said Silva looked like a caged animal during introductions. How did this man, who by all accounts is a nice, normal person, become the feral animal we saw in the ring?
When I grew up, I'm poor, I'm fat, I suffer a lot of bullying, I have a tough time. I know I wanted the things and I don't have. All that bad moments make we mad inside. And when I'm gonna fight, I know I'm doing good and I want the fight is just the way to change my life, to be something, to have something. And when I am in the gym, I know I'm back where I came from because I know that is too hard. I want to go in the front because this is, I think, the only way I can change my life.
Being able to control your anger and channel it effectively requires tremendous mental strength and confidence. It's a tactic that isn't often employed by elite-level competition, but it worked for Wanderlei, as former Pride commentator and mixed martial arts legend Bas Rutten shares.
If somebody can use anger to his advantage, it's him. Like with me, I do not want to be angry before a fight because it makes me load up my punches. I'm telegraphing, so I try to be in the calmest state of mind because I always say an angry person loads up, but man, Wanderlei, he broke that mold. That guy knows exactly how to fight with anger and then just destroying his opponents. Yeah, he's just what a different kind of breed of fighter that guy is.
The expectations that people have for most fighters didn't apply to him. There was a different level of risk when fighting a guy like Wanderlei. Someone wouldn't hesitate to put himself in harm's way to impose his will. There were a lot of great fighters who would win without knocking their opponents out or inflicting major damage. That wasn't the way Wanderlei did business. He was always looking for the knockout. He was always trying to inflict as much damage as possible. Most guys didn't want to fight someone like him. During Silva's fight with Alexander Otsuka at Cold Fury 2, commentator Stephen Quadros mentioned they overheard some fighters talking backstage about Wanderlei, saying he's someone they wouldn't want to fight.
There are a lot of fighters who are great in the gym, but not great once they get in real competition. The intensity and pressure that comes with a real fight can be too much for some people. Not everyone can handle that kind of heat. As for Wanderlei, he loved the heat. He lived for the pressure. That was his world. He relished in the moments that many others tried to avoid. Many fighters want to win without exposing themselves to damage. Wanderlei was never afraid to put himself in harm's way in order to win. His opponents knew he was going to go for broke in every fight. They knew he was going to inflict damage and force him to take risks they wouldn't normally consider. That was when he was at his best. When he got his opponents off their game plan, he had them right where he wanted.
Wanderlei's next fight would be arguably the biggest of his career. He would face his archenemy, Quinton Jackson, in their long-anticipated rematch. Wanderlei knocked out Jackson a year earlier to win the 2003 Pride Middleweight Grand Prix, but there were still some questions left to be answered. Both Jackson and Silva fought earlier that evening. Jackson's opponent, Chuck Liddell, was a much bigger name in the sport than Silva's opponent, Hidehiko Yoshida, so some felt that Jackson had a harder fight prior. The rematch would answer any questions and end all speculation. Within the opening seconds, they came out and started throwing punches before locking up into a clinch, where they both delivered punches and knees to the body. After an accidental low blow by Jackson, there was a short pause in the action for Wanderlei to recover. Once they started going again, Wanderlei was throwing big hook combinations, while Jackson showed great defense, as he blocked them for the most part. Wanderlei threw a big combination of punches and knees that got through Jackson's defense. They appeared to hurt Jackson a little bit before Jackson got him in an awkward headlock because of their positioning and took Wanderlei down.
As soon as they got to the mat, we could see that Jackson had a big cut in his left eye. After getting restarted back in Silva's guard, Jackson worked some ground and pound action, while Silva showed some good jiu-jitsu defense. Jackson was keeping busy on the ground, even though guest commentator Mario Sperry said he was using a lot of energy and wasn't really hurting Wanderlei. After being restarted back on their feet, Jackson knocked Silva down with a right straight that landed right on the button. Wanderlei was in trouble, and Jackson was trying to finish him with a minute left in the 10-minute first round. Wanderlei was able to hang on though with good jiu-jitsu defense. There was a feeling that maybe Wanderlei was saved by the bell in this round, even though that's impossible to say. He was almost certainly losing the fight at this point.
The second round started with some clinch work and a quick takedown for Jackson. Wanderlei quickly threw his legs in what looked like an armbar attempt, but he was able to throw Jackson off of him and stand back up. After getting back to their feet, Wanderlei looked like he was trying to press the action more and turn the tables. Wanderlei then landed a crushing right hook to Jackson's face. Jackson went reeling backwards into the ropes, with Silva chasing after him. Wanderlei caught Jackson in the Muay Thai clinch, as Jackson charged him, trying to get his footing. Wanderlei then landed a knee to the chin that knocked Jackson out cold. Jackson crashed halfway through the ropes, his body hanging out of the ring. Former Pride Vice President Jerry Millen was nearby.
I was sitting ringside at the Quinn Jackson fight when Wanderlei hit him with those knees, and he sent Quinn through the ropes right in front of me, and blood just flew out of Quinn's face.
Wanderlei reflected on the moment.
How did it feel after you knocked him out and you saw him there on the ropes?
Yeah, this is a good question, because when I have this movement, this be like a martial art. Like you paint something, you make one sculpture. And I'm thinking, somebody can watch it just like 1,000 years from right now and say, hey, this is good. This is a martial arts. And make one movement like that. At me, when I hit him on the face, I feel something in my knee, and when I look at him on the ropes, and all the blood go out, and the public I scream very loud. And that moment for me I think, in one of the best moments of my career, because this be a plastic, and I think this is my best knockout ever.
Yeah, it's just incredible. There was a moment right after you knocked him out. You looked at him and you kind of like celebrated. Then you ran and jumped up on the rope and you flexed and you yelled something in Portuguese. Do you remember what you yelled?
Yeah, see, like a caralho. Caralho is a dick. Oh, shit. I can't believe like that. Oh, yeah. Yeah, something we usually say over here.
Sports Illustrated called it the knockout of the decade in 2004. Following the fight, Prix decided to set up a fourth match for Sakuraba. This fight would be held on December 31st, 2004, exactly 2 months after the Jackson fight. His second win over Jackson was spectacular, but it didn't come easy. Jackson hit him several times, and had him seriously hurt in the first round. It would make sense for Wanderlei to take some time off after such a hard fight, but at the same time, Sakuraba was an amazing grappler, but he wasn't thought to be a dangerous striker, so Wanderlei's risk of getting knocked out was pretty small. Fighting Sakuraba for a fourth time, after 2 knockout finishes and a broken collarbone, didn't make much sense on paper. But the people at Pride wanted another big fight for the New Year's Eve show, and Wanderlei vs. Sakuraba was still a big fight. And Sakuraba was still one of the best in the world, so he was certainly dangerous.
But an issue came up, and Wanderlei would now be facing former K1 world champion Mark Hunt. At the time, we were informed that Sakuraba had suffered an injury, but Wanderlei told us that wasn't really the case.
This is my choice. The guy's coming 2 days before the fight and say, hey, you can fight against Tamura, Nakamura, or Sakuraba, one of these 3 guys. But if you accept fight against Mark Hunt, he's like 70 pounds more than you, we pay for you double. Like at the moment I make 500,000, I say, we pay $1 million for you. I'm back to my room and say, hey man, it's $1 million, no? And he's just one guy. But man, let's go, no, let's do it. And in that moment, on that day, I changed my life. I started to have more money, more comfortable life. And never more in my life, I won lost less than this.
Changing opponents from Sakuraba to Mark Hunt is about as extreme as it gets. Sakuraba was a top submission fighter, who probably weighed under 200 pounds at the time. Hunt was one of the most dangerous strikers on the planet, and he weighed around 275 pounds. Wanderlei accepted the fight on 48 hours' notice. Training for one type of opponent, and then having that opponent switch to one with a completely different skill set at the last minute can be hard to overcome. Wanderlei's training was unique in this way because, as Rafael Cordeiro explained earlier, it wasn't necessarily tailored for one specific opponent. Wanderlei would be fighting with the same skill set he always brought to the ring.
But Wanderlei had to watch out. Mark Hunt had great boxing skills, with knockout power in both hands. He was also known for having a legendary chin as a heavyweight kickboxer. And, unlike most of Silva's opponents, Hunt wasn't intimidated by him. It was only Hunt's third MMA fight, and he'd been submitted by Yoshida in his first fight. So he was beatable, but people started to wonder if the ex-murderer had finally bitten off a little more than he could chew. He was able to take Hunt down early on, but Hunt found his way back up pretty quickly. Hunt then knocked Silva down with a left hook, but Wanderlei quickly popped back up.
Silva knew he would have to stand with Hunt to some extent, and he went toe-to-toe with him again and again. This fight was a great example of the fearlessness Silva has shown in fighting, dating all the way back to when he started at Shoot Box. Commentators Randy Couture and Boss Rutten thought Wanderlei did enough to earn the decision victory, but two of the judges didn't see it that way, and Hunt went on to win a split decision. Even though it was a loss on his record, Silva's stock didn't go down much as a fighter. He fought well against a guy he probably shouldn't even been in there with. He went toe-to-toe with one of the most feared strikers in the world at the time. He was also in a much better financial situation now.
By this point, Wanderlei had achieved about all there is to achieve in the sport. He'd been a world champion for years, and had beaten most of the top guys. He won over 20 fights in a row before his loss to Hunt. He was at the pinnacle of his sport, the peak of his craft. In 2005, Prix decided to hold another middleweight Grand Prix. Wanderlei would face a familiar foe in the opening round, Hidehiko Yoshida. This was the rematch that a lot of Japanese fans were waiting for. Yoshida gave Silva a harder time than maybe any other Japanese fighter. Yoshida had seen some action since her last contest, with matches against top competition in Hoist Gracie, Rulon Gardner, and the aforementioned Mark Hunt. Wanderlei had been at the top for a long time. Was this going to be Yoshida's time? The Japanese fans certainly hoped so.
Wanderlei didn't waste any time, going straight at Yoshida with punches before taking him down, with some help from Yoshida actually. Even though he was on top of Yoshida, Wanderlei was still in peril. After a couple of minutes, Yoshida was issued a yellow card for lack of action. A yellow card impacts a fighter on the judge's scorecard, and the fighter loses 10% of their purse each time they receive one. Once back on their feet, Wanderlei appeared more patient with his striking for a moment before some exciting exchanges that saw both fighters swinging wildly, and Yoshida smiling at Wanderlei after them. Yoshida was ready to strike with Wanderlei, and it appeared that his confidence was growing. He went for a couple of takedowns, but Wanderlei showed great sprawling and clinch work to keep him at bay.
That was until Yoshida took him down with a beautiful hip throw and moved to side mount and then a scarf position. Wanderlei then used his jiu-jitsu to work his way out of it and back up to his feet. Yoshida took Silva down a minute later, which is where the fight stayed until near the end of the round. The second round started with Wanderlei pushing forward and Yoshida bouncing around the ring. Yoshida then pulled Silva into his guard as he went to his back. But Silva was able to land more shots from Yoshida's guard in this round. Yoshida seemed like he was able to control the action more still. In the third round, Wanderlei's conditioning started to shine. He continued pushing the pace as Yoshida started to show fatigue. Wanderlei's leg kicks began landing more frequently and with greater force. It was still anyone's fight with just a few minutes left, but Wanderlei dominated the end of the fight with his speed and timing. Yoshida desperately tried for one last submission attempt, but when communicating with the referee, Wanderlei shook his finger like he was fine. In a fight that was even closer than the first one, Wanderlei won by split decision.
In the following round, he would go on to face Kazuhiro Nakamura, who was coming off a decision win over Kevin Randleman. Nakamura came out throwing big punches and showed a lot of courage, going toe-to-toe with Silva, which made the Japanese fans happy, many of whom were probably still bitter over the Yoshida decision a couple of months prior. Silva knocked Nakamura down a couple of minutes later, but after Wanderlei got a little clumsy with a couple of head stomps, Nakamura got a hold of him and put him on his back. Wanderlei managed to escape shortly after, when Nakamura went for what looked like an Ezekiel choke with his gi. Nakamura continued to go toe-to-toe with Wanderlei for another minute, before he stepped back and decided to take off his gi mid-action. Wanderlei immediately knocked him down and finished him with punches on the ground a minute later. In the next event, Final Conflict 2005, Wanderlei would need to win twice again in the same night, just like 2 years prior. His first opponent would be submission expert Ricardo Arona, from the main rival of the Chute Box Academy, Brazilian Top Team. The Chute Box Academy and Brazilian Top Team had a legendary rivalry in Pride, which created some great fights, like Ninja Hua vs. Mario Sperry and Shogun Hua versus Rogerio Nogueira.
In the finals, he would meet the winner of Alistair Overeem versus his teammate, Mauricio Shogun Hua. Many people expected Shogun to move on to the finals, which he did, and many people expected to see Wanderlei fighting his younger teammate in the championship. They were prepared for this possibility. The Chute Box Academy was known for having grueling training sessions, as Boss Rutten shares.
From what I understand, what the trainers told me, they just gear up in training and they just try to slaughter each other, and that's their training. And I like hard sparring as well, not to the head though. I wouldn't do that. But in Holland, we used to train like that as well.
Ricardo Arona may not have been the biggest name in the tournament, but he is not one to be taken lightly. He was strong physically and had world-class jiu-jitsu skills. Wanderlei didn't particularly like Arona. He called him a show-off and said he was going to bust his face up in pre-fight interviews. Arona took a swipe at Wanderlei as well before the fight, saying he's the least complete fighter left in the tournament.
This fight started slow, with both fighters showing a lot of patience and respect for one another. Arona landed a hard leg kick that caught Silva off balance and knocked him down a few minutes later. Arona then worked in Silva's guard and stayed active with hard punches. Arona controlled the action throughout most of the fight and went on to win a unanimous decision before losing the Shogun in the finals. Wanderlei would meet Arona 4 months later and defeat him in a split decision. Wanderlei found a stylistic matchup nightmare in Arona, but was still able to overcome it and find a way to win.
The following year would find Wanderlei entering his third and final Pride tournament, the 2006 Openweight Grand Prix. This tournament included fighters from different weight classes. Nearly all of the 15 competitors were heavyweights. Wanderlei wasn't originally going to participate in the tournament, but had agreed to replace Fedor Emelianenko, who suffered a hand injury in training. In Wanderlei's first fight, he would face 245-pound Kazuyuki Fujita. Known for an iron chin, solid wrestling, and a great heart, Fujita appeared to be a tough matchup for Wanderlei.
After some circling, they had an exchange where they both connected. Wanderlei backpedaled into the ropes, which made Fujita chase after him. Wanderlei landed a big left hook that sent Fujita stumbling backwards. Wanderlei quickly landed punches and knees to the head that stunned Fujita and nearly ended it, but Fujita fought on. He even put Wanderlei on his back for a few minutes before both men issued a yellow card for lack of action. Silva landed a big overhand right with a hard left hook that staggered Fujita again, but this time, Wanderlei poured on the assault with punch combinations that put him down on all fours. From there, Wanderlei landed several soccer kicks to Fujita's head before the fight ended. It was a huge win for Wanderlei. Fujita was known for being almost impossible to stop, and Wanderlei finished him in the first round, even though he was much smaller. Something peculiar about the end of this fight is how the referee was looking at the corner, while Wanderlei was soccer kicking Fujita. It seemed like he either wanted to end it or was looking for someone to throw in the towel. Then the bell rang before the ref stopped it. It almost seemed like there was someone beside the referee deciding when it should end.
In his next fight, he would face a familiar foe in Mirko Krokop. This would be a rematch from their special rules bout 4 years earlier. Krokop had established himself as one of the most feared fighters in the world at this point, and he went on to knock Wanderlei out in the first round with his legendary left high kick. How was Krokop different the second time than the first time?
On the second time, the difference is because he hit me on my eyes when the fight just started, but on top of that, inside my eyes, and this hurt me a lot. I can't see with his eyes. And after that, he hit me other times in the same place, and all the things going wrong. It's a tough day.
It was the first time Wanderlei had been finished in 31 fights, the last time coming nearly 8 years earlier against Vitor Belfort at UFC 17.5. By this time, Silva was one of the biggest fighters in Japan. He'd been thrilling fans for the past 5 years in the organization. His friend, mixed martial arts veteran Frank Trigg, shared a couple of other factors that may have contributed to his popularity.
He's absolutely fearless. He walks into a fight and does not care about the consequences, isn't worried about getting his eyes swollen closed. He's not worried about getting his arm dislocated. He's going out there specifically to earn money for his family. That's what he is doing. He's going to do it. He's going to do it as violently as humanly possible. And that's what made him such a big superstar, especially in Japan, because they don't have a lot of countries. Like in America, we're kind of used to violence. We see it on TV every night. We see it in our movies. We see it, and we see people arguing when we walk down the street. We see people beeping their horns and flipping each other off. Like we're kind of used to violence, right? Japan doesn't have that kind of violent sense that we do. So he became very huge in Japan because he is a complete opposite of what they're used to seeing. He didn't care. He'd show up. He wouldn't talk trash. He wasn't a trash talker. I'm not saying that. But he'd go in, he'd show up, he'd be ready for his fight, he'd go in and he'd fight and be the most violent fighter of the entire card.
This fight wasn't at middleweight, so Wanderlei remained the middleweight champion. He would next go against another man he'd faced before, Dan Henderson. Wanderlei defeated Henderson 6 years earlier by decision in convincing fashion. Henderson was a top fighter, though, and he'd come a long way since Wanderlei gave him his first loss in 2001. He'd beaten many top fighters, including knockout wins over Renzo Gracie, Murillo Bustamante, and decision wins over Vito Belfort and Wanderlei's shoot-box teammate, Murillo Ninja Hua. He was a Pride welterweight champion at the time at 185 pounds, and at the top of his game. This fight would be held in Las Vegas, and would have different rules than the Pride shows in Japan. Kicking and kneeing to the head of a down opponent would not be allowed. This took away some of Wanderlei's greatest weapons. Kneeing and kicking people in the head on the ground were a couple of his trademark moves. They were key to some of his biggest wins, like in his first fights against Henderson and Sakuraba.
This is another example of Wanderlei going above and beyond to be accommodating in order to compete. He agreed to fight Krokop the first time under special rules that favored the heavyweight kickboxing champion. He fought Mark Hunt in 48 hours' notice, even though he was outweighed by almost 70 pounds. He went up in weight for the open weight tournament, only to get knocked out by Krokop in their second fight. And now he's getting in the ring against Dan Henderson, without access to some of his greatest weapons. Wanderlei had shared some things with Frank Trigg that concerned him shortly after his second fight with Krokop.
He's like, yeah, I've been dealing with these massive headaches this entire time. For this training camp, it's been really hard for me to spar because I've always got this headache. I'm like, dude, you got a concussion. You got to take care of that. And he's like, oh, I'll be fine. I'll take care of it later. Literally, that's what he says. Like, I'm fine. I'll take care of it later. Then the fight happens at Pride 33. Backstage, his warm-up, we're in the same locker room. I had Diaz was in my locker room, and then Wanderlei was in my locker room, the three of us. So Diaz fought first, then I fought next, and then Wanderlei fought, obviously, at the end of the card, so he had an empty locker room to himself when he was getting ready. And he was like, when I went back after my fight to go shower and change, he's like, if I remember correctly, he was like, he kept yelling at Hujamar, like, you're not holding the pads in the right position. You're not doing things right. You're not, it's like, I don't understand why you're doing it differently. And what it was is that his mind and his muscles weren't clicking together. He couldn't get ready. And that happens a lot when you have brain trauma. Like, you can't get your body to work in the same factor. And then I went up front, put my suit on, went up front, started commentating, and then of course, it didn't seem until he walked out.
This fight was largely spent with these two in the middle of the ring, slugging it out. As the first round came to an end, both fighters opened up with big shots that rocked each other just before the bell.
In the second round, Henderson took it to the mat. As well-rounded as Wanderlei is, Henderson was an Olympic wrestler, so the grappling advantage was clearly in his favor. Wanderlei did a fair job protecting himself on his back, but Henderson controlled the action for nearly the entire round. Wanderlei had a nice armbar attempt in the final minute, but didn't get close to a submission. Wanderlei appeared to press the action more in the third round than previously. He and Dan had an exchange in the corner, where they both landed shots that commentator Josh Barnett said he could hear from the announcer's table. He said it sounded like a piece of flesh getting hit with a sledgehammer. Henderson went for a takedown a minute later, but Wanderlei showed great defense and even took Dan's back for a minute. After breaking free, Henderson hit Wanderlei with a spinning back fist that staggered him. He landed a big right hand a few seconds later, and then a left hook that knocked Wanderlei out. It was a scary moment. Frank Trigg was in the broadcasting booth for it.
But when he caught him and Wanderlei went down, I immediately was like, oh my gosh, like, this is going to be a situation where Wanderlei might not be able to recover from this and be able to fight again, because he got hit so hard by that overhand right. And he was unconscious the moment it touched his chin. And so he was unconscious all the way down to the ground, which, to the folks at home that have never been knocked out, it's a lot more dangerous when you're knocked out on your feet and hit the ground. The most knockouts you see on TV, the most knockouts you see when guys, they're kind of somewhat awake until they hit the ground, then their heads hit the ground, that's what puts them unconscious. Wanderlei was knocked out on his feet. So he falls 6 feet, his head travels 6 feet before it hits the canvas and bounces again. You're like, wow, that's a really devastating knockout. That's really going to be a bad one. And it was amazing to watch him after pop back up. Like, after the fight was over, you're like, wow, he's tough as all balls. Like, he got up right after and walked on under his own accord, but you thought for sure he wasn't going to make it.
This fight was the end of an era in Wanderlei's career. This was the first time he'd lost back-to-back fights. And on top of that, he'd suffered 2 brutal knockouts 6 months apart. This fight would also be his last in the Pride Fighting Championships. At around this time, Wanderlei decided to leave the Chute Box Academy and start training at Randy Couture's Extreme Couture Gym in Las Vegas. Randy and Wanderlei were among the best fighters of their era, and they actually wanted to compete against each other at one point, when Randy was the light heavyweight champion of the UFC. None of that mattered, though. Wanderlei and Randy were both professionals, and actually developed a friendship during Wanderlei's time there, as Randy explains.
It was just a unbridled ferociousness about his competition, and hence the name, I think, the Axe Murderer. I mean, it's just how he was, and a great guy too. Just such a sweetheart to be around, which is, that dichotomy in how he competes versus his genuine personality was something that was very interesting with him as well.
In March of 2007, the Ultimate Fighting Championship purchased Pride and all of its assets, including its fighter contracts. This acquisition eventually set up Wanderlei's next fight against UFC legend Chuck Liddell. Silva and Liddell had been on each other's radar for years, but were never able to face off. Liddell was the UFC representative in Pride's middleweight Grand Prix in 2003, but was eliminated by Quinton Jackson in the semifinal round. Liddell was also on a 2-fight losing streak, having lost the UFC title in his second loss to Jackson in 2007, and then lost a split decision to Keith Jardine. This fight may not have been quite as big as it would have been a couple of years prior, but was still a long-anticipated matchup between two legendary strikers.
This fight had great action. Both fighters landed big shots, and both were stunned at times, but neither appeared to be in serious trouble at any point. In the end, Liddell won a unanimous decision, in a fight that won Fight of the Year honors at the World MMA Awards.
Wanderlei was on a 3-fight losing streak, but won his next fight 6 months later, with a 36-second knockout over Keith Jardine. His next fight would be his third against Quinton Jackson. Wanderlei's previous knockout wins over Jackson were a couple of the biggest wins of his career. Jackson lost the UFC light heavyweight title to Forrest Griffin, but was still a top fighter, with wins over Liddell and Henderson the previous year. Jackson would go on to defeat Wanderlei by knockout in the first round.
He would next face former UFC middleweight champion Rich Franklin.
He's kind of like, once you get on the inside, it's as if you've stepped into a blender in the kitchen and the blender just got turned on.
Rich knew getting in the blender with Wanderlei would be a bad idea, and he kept that in mind when creating his game plan.
We knew in my camp that in facing him, what I needed to do was make sure that I didn't get greedy with the punches, particularly on the inside, stay at range, utilize the jab really well, and keep my combinations to 2 or 3 max and then move and angle off before I threw another punch or another strike of any kind. Because Wanderlei does a good job of closing that distance and sucking you in, and once he gets started, he just doesn't stop.
Franklin executed his game plan superbly and controlled the action to get a unanimous decision victory. Franklin had been a fan of Wanderlei for years. He shared his feelings from when he was younger, as well as leading up to it.
Always a fan favorite, Wanderlei Silva, the Axe Murderer. His stare down, the way, what he does with his hands, the motion with his hands. And I just remember at that time, as a young athlete, thinking like, man, it would be crazy to have to step in the ring with this guy. Particularly with his style of fighting anyway. And so then, as you fast forward through my career, suddenly I find myself standing across the cage against the Axe Murderer. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, wow, I can remember watching this on television and thinking about how intimidating that stare down was. And when we did our stare down, for the press conferences, the weigh-ins, the first time that we ever did a stare down, I remember just thinking to myself, he didn't disappoint. It's still intimidating.
At this point, it was becoming clear that Wanderlei was in a different phase of his career. He lost 5 of his last 6 fights, including 3 of his first 4 in the UFC. After a unanimous decision win over future UFC Hall of Famer Michael Bisping, Wanderlei would face another fighter who liked to brawl, in Chris Leben. Leben had been a fan of Wanderlei for a long time prior as well.
Wanderlei was a hero of mine. I idolized the way that he fought. He was so aggressive, so savage, so overwhelming. And, I mean, vicious, especially in those Pride years.
Leben knew how dangerous Silva was, and was candid about his feelings immediately before their fight.
Standing in that ring and all the lights go out and Zombie Nation comes on, and then I look over and he's doing his fucking wrist thing, and I'm like, what the fuck was I thinking? What? I asked for this shit? This, unreal.
What was supposed to be a slugfest turned out to be a knockout win for Leben 27 seconds into the first round. It was another tough loss for Silva. Leben reflected on the fight.
That was one of those fights where I got lucky, I was scared to death. I didn't think I was going to win. I really just wanted to fight Wanderlei because, he was a hero of mine.
Wanderlei would go on to stop Kung Lee with punches and knees in the second round of their bout in November of 2011.
In March of 2013, Wanderlei met Brian Stann in the ring for what would be one of his final and most memorable fights. Stann was a retired U.S. Marine captain and Iraq war hero who was awarded the Silver Star for valor in combat. Stan was a former WEC light heavyweight champion and held wins over Chris Leben, Jorge Santiago, and Alessio Sakara. Wanderlei had a game plan going into this fight that mostly went out the window in the first few minutes, as he explains.
Thinking I'm gonna use the first round to study, the second I go a little bit more and give everything on the last. But he don't read the script because he came like 100%. Pa, pa, pa. And I say, man, this is tough because with 2 minutes of the fight, my heart, the adrenaline is high, and I'm really tired, and the fight be that way. But it is be a huge fight, and it's the honor for me fight against Brian Stan.
This fight had great stand-up action, with both fighters standing toe-to-toe slugging it out. A memorable moment from this fight came midway through the first, when Wanderlei waved Stan in with his left hand, and then immediately threw a right hook. Both fighters showed incredible heart and stamina in a fight that won Fight of the Night honors, but in the end, Wanderlei finished Stan by a knockout after landing a big left hook just below Stan's right ear.
Following the Stan fight, Wanderlei took a 4-year break from competition. He would serve as a coach alongside Chael Sonnen on The Ultimate Fighter Brazil 3, after what became a bitter rivalry between them. Sonnen had made controversial comments about Brazilian people that obviously made Silva upset. They would have some memorable moments on the show before meeting years later in Bellator, where Sonnen went on to win a unanimous decision. Wanderlei actually ran into Tito Ortiz shortly after the fight.
I remember after Chael beat him in that decision, I saw him in the elevator, and I was like, man, I wish he'd kick this fucking ass. I hate that fucking guy. And he was, he was bummed, though. He was bummed he lost because he thought he could win. I thought he could win. And I was trying to coach him on some positions, too. I mean, I want him to win. I like Wanderlei a lot. I think he's a really good guy, and I can say I follow him on his Instagram. I watch what he does for his country and for his city, and I respect for the fighter and person he is.
In Wanderlei's final fight, he took on Quinton Jackson for a 4th time and lost via TKO near the end of the 2nd round. Wanderlei's mixed martial arts career was one of the most memorable and exciting in the sport's history. During his reign in Pride, he won 15 fights by knockout, 12 of which came in the first round. The first rounds in Pride were 10 minutes compared to the 5-minute rounds in the UFC. It's worth noting, though, during Wanderlei's Pride and UFC careers, he finished 8 opponents in the first 5 minutes of action, more than any of his main contemporaries.
What separated Wanderlei from his contemporaries was how he finished his opponents. His distinct form of brutality struck fear in opponents more so than any other fighter in his era. His determination to take on all competition demonstrated his fearless approach to the sport. Wanderlei was not only the 2003 Pride middleweight Grand Prix champion, he also had the most wins in Pride history with 22, had the most consecutive wins in Pride history with 20, had the most knockouts in Pride history with 15. He actually finished his career with 27 knockouts and TKOs. By comparison, that's 4 more than Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz put together. He also had the most title defenses and consecutive title defenses in Pride history with 4. He went undefeated for well over 4 years while at the top of the sport in Pride, longer than any light heavyweight champion of his era.
Wanderlei has settled into the next chapter in his life, with his wife T, their son Thor, and his daughter from a previous relationship, Rafaela. His wife T has helped him slow down and enjoy the little things in life a bit more, as he shares.
Yeah, she's a really smart girl. I'm happy to be married to her. I learned a lot. I learned about the quality of the life. I learned to make my life not too fast, more slow, enjoy the life, start to love what I have, start to like just what I want. And I changed a lot of my life.
He's also had more time to spend with his son in recent years and enjoy quality time with him.
I like to be with my son. We ride the bike. We train together. We watch movies. I like reading a lot.
He also stays busy promoting mixed martial arts in his home country of Brazil, at his Van Fight Team gym in Las Vegas, and throughout the world. He's also gone to great lengths to help underprivileged youths, so they can have the same opportunities he had when he was younger.
Promoting one event in Korea. I promote events over here. I bring some fighters to Japan, bring some fighters to Korea. And right now we start to have some programs on my state. I call one master, one teacher, one martial art teacher inside the schools to give a class to the kids, to everybody, free. We try to do that over here to give a chance to other guys, the same chance can I have because I never been in the gym. I never gonna know I have this talent. I never gonna know my potential, and I try to help the other guys have the same opportunity can I have this time.
Wanderlei's fighting style shocked and excited fans, while his heart and courage were an inspiration to others. He put himself in harm's way and laid it on the line for his family and fans, as he thrilled us with some of the most exciting moments in the sport's history. His savagery in the ring juxtaposed his kind demeanor as a person. Part of Wanderlei's legacy lies in the fact that we'll probably never see another fighter like him again. When people today talk about how brutal the Pride era was, Wanderlei's fights are almost always the first things that get talked about. He was also one of the true pioneers of the sport, as Jerry Millen explains.
Wanderlei Silva helped pave the way for guys like Conor McGregor, because without Wanderlei Silva, you wouldn't have Conor McGregor. So he will be known as one of the greatest ever to fight in this game, and you can never take that away from him. He'll be known as one of the greatest ever to help create the sport and lead the way for the guys that are coming behind him.
He's a gentleman, a family man, and as a competitor, he was exactly as his nickname described, an ex-murderer.
Like what you just heard? Check us out on Twitter and Instagram at MMA TrueFan. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube. Please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Special thanks to Wanderlei Silva, Rafael Cordeiro, Bob Schribjer, Tito Ortiz, Chris Leben, Frank Trigg, Stephen Quadros, Boss Rutten, Dan Henderson, Randy Couture, Rich Franklin, and Jerry Millen. Translation by Viviani Scorski. Music by With Lions Productions. Artwork by Mike Zandt.